Okay, 2 minutes after the usual start time, we will dig into Lecture 15 here. As it happens, I will be circling back a little bit to Lecture 14 just because there's a couple of notes of unfinished business that I would like to do. But once we do that, we'll talk about the exciting world of externalities. And it's kind of an interesting lecture. I think you'll see that there may be reason to think a little bit more deeply about some of the things I've contended throughout the course of the semester. Anyways, so before we get to all that good stuff, there's a new homework up, right? And that should be all the homework that you're going to have before our next exam, which, as you can see, is about a week and a half away, right? So today we'll have some new material. Next time we'll have new material. And then that will also be where I disseminate all the practice materials. And then, of course, we'll do our full review on the 4th of November. We'll have an exam the 7th, right, Thursday. And then I believe I've already fixed it, but the due dates of your homework I think I set to Sunday, which by my calculations, 7, 8, 9, 10th would be the 10th of November. Right, so that will be kind of the, I guess if you think about the homework and the online exam and the exam and all that stuff, our second cycle, our second of 3 cycles will end November 10th, right? And I have not yet decided what the situation is with the online component of the exam. Exactly the same as last time, right? The same sequence of events, same setup, all that stuff. Like I haven't decided how long I'm gonna leave it open, because I am, desperately, or I will be desperately trying to get everything back to you, the class after the exam, which would be Monday the 11th. Okay, so we have plenty of time to talk about that stuff, right? Now that we all, we know how the exam will go here. So let's revisit a couple of key things about game theory. You'll remember last time we talked a little bit about this. We talked quite a bit about this notion of Nash equilibrium in these games that people played, where you'd sort of have this simple set of actions. The players would kind of write down what they were going to do, or they would commit to an action, and then we would reveal what everybody decided to do, right, and figure out the payoffs. And we thought about Nash equilibria, dominant strategies, stuff like that. And of course, we got some of our enduring games, or some of our classics laid out there, one of which was The Prisoner's Dilemma. More on that today. Now, it so happens that a lot of games, really what we want to emphasize about them is that they occur throughout time, or through time, I should say, right? So this just means that there's some sort of sequence of events that takes place in according to time, in some particular order. Right, and so a lot of games have sequential structure like this, where one player, say, moves first, and then another moves. And once again, you can think about the simplest such game that looks like that is interesting. It's usually a game where one player makes a decision, yes or no, and then another player makes a decision, yes or no. What happens? Right? We can think a little bit about how we might understand those situations, think about what the results look like, and then you can use the basic concepts to do a whole bunch of things, kind of like we did last time. So as it happens, I'm going to do a little bit of this and show you what the basic logic is. Basically enough to get you through the problem set so you can show some command of these problems on your own. But then maybe I have some suggestive things that you can work on, and then we'll go back to think a little bit about environmental economics. So just a couple of classics here. One example, one enduring example of a dynamic game has this entrant monopoly structure. Right, so you might think about it this way. You run a pizza place, right, in your neighborhood, say, right, and somebody else says, oh, well, then Baker's Pizza Place is doing quite well. Maybe I want to start up a pizza place, right? And so I get wind of your plan to start a pizza place in my neighborhood. I'm kind of the local monopolist, right? But now I'm going to have competition from you, an entrant, and I say, you know what, I don't like this. So if you enter the pizza market in this neighborhood, I'm going to start a price war. I'm going to sell all my pizzas at $1 a slice, and that way no one will make any money. Haha, what do you think of that? I threaten you, right? So this is an enduring problem in economics, and we want to think about, well, are these threats credible, right? What does game theory say about these sorts of threats, put another way? Of course, there's other examples like this. My second example that I'll talk about is what you might think about as the father-son punishment game. So I have a son maybe. My son's a good kid, so I don't know if he would, if this would apply to him, but we'll follow the example, right? So you have a son, I have a son, and I say, well, I would like you to behave in a certain way, and the son says, well, I'm going to do what I want, and that might not be what you want me to do. And I say, well, if you don't do what I want, I'm going to punish you, and I really don't like punishing you, right? But I'm going to do it, if I have to. And the son says, okay, well, let's see here. If I behave the way I want to, that might be good for me now. And my dad says he's going to punish me if I don't. Well, but he also said he didn't really like to punish me. What do I make of that threat, right? So those are two examples. And you can see, maybe just if you look at those examples carefully, that what we're trying to do is set up some tension between what I'm saying I will do, right, and what I actually will do. Right? In both cases, it seems like if it comes to it, I might not have an incentive to carry out my threat. And indeed, these themes of credibility are often an important aspect of these dynamic games, right? And we will want to ask this question, will threats be carried out? We might also ask the related question, given we found out, given our results, what does this say about competition and societal welfare in general, right? Okay. So the first thing we want to do is, once again, like last class we had playing surfaces, playing boards for our games. Here's kind of the same thing. We might just want to first have this visual representation of our game. So what I have here are, if you want, game trees, right? We call those extensive form games, or games depicted in the extensive form. And oftentimes these are well suited to do these dynamic games where there's a sequence of events that occur over time. And so you can see here I have the game set up so that I guess I have Son and Baker over here on the right, Entrant and Monopolist on the left, so that the first thing that happens along the tree is that very first decision in our time scheme, right? So the entrant decides whether or not to enter the pizza market, say, and then the monopoly, once it is observed whether the entrant enters or not, the monopolist then decides to behave aggressively or to cooperate. And you can see that whenever everybody has selected their actions, you sort of work your way down the tree to the very bottom nodes, right? The so-called terminal nodes, right? And at these terminal nodes, we have payoffs, right? 1, 5, 0, 0, 2, 2, 2, right? On the left-hand side. And what those payoffs are, well, usually you list them so that the first person to move, right, in the game, that's the first payoff listed when there's these two people here. So 1, 5, that's kind of how you would understand if the entrant stays out of the industry, what the monopolist and what the entrant get. Over here, if my son decides to obey me, he gets 0 and I get 10, right? Because I'm happy that my son is obeying me. If my son defies me, well, then now I have to decide, B has to make a decision. I have to not punish or punish, and you can see my payoffs are, if I punish, -5 from my son, -1 from me, right? And so this is how a sequential game works. Now it turns out, just as is with the case with Nash equilibrium, we have this nice set of tools that we can apply, right? There it was best responses. Here we can kind of do that, but in a dynamic way, right? And really what we do is we work backwards, just as I am now doing through my bullet points, starting with the last one here. We work backwards through the game to find its solution. And we call this technique backwards induction, which is you start at the last possible decision, right? Figure out what will be done at that point, and then once you figure that out, you back up, and then knowing what will transpire from that point forward, you can figure out what happens at the point before that, all the way back up the tree, right? And here the trees are, once again, as simple as they possibly can be. Now, in so doing that, we arrive at a concept called subgame perfection, which sounds like a difficult term. Really, it just says that any game, right, once we've gotten to a point of the game, going forward, whatever people do must be rational for them to do, right? And so when we think about, subgame means any set of nodes that aren't the last nodes. When you think about the simple position when I get to should the entrant enter and then the monopoly make a decision, whatever happens at that point, the monopolist has to sort of make its best possible decision. It has to be rational. And so it turns out, if you think about backwards induction, when we use this method, all of our games have this subgame perfect quality, which means that everybody behaves perfectly rationally throughout the entire game tree. You can think about it that way. By the way, one reason why I'm doing this is because not just in economics, but in any situation where you're solving a dynamic game or a dynamic problem, backwards induction is usually a pretty tried and true method for solving said problems, right? Start at the end. It's usually by that point the problem is very simple, right? And you can just work your way back up the tree. So I have these two examples. Maybe what I'll do now is I'll just show you how I would work these using backwards induction. Let's see, go to the slideshow, like that. I actually copied down the games here, so you don't have to watch me copy them over. But this is the monopolist entrant game. So here I have the entrant deciding to stay out or come in, enter, and then I have the monopolist behaving aggressively or cooperating, right? So how would we solve this? Well, there's really not much to do at this point, right? 1-5. If the entrant stays out, the game is over. But if the entrant decides to enter, we then find the monopolist has to make a decision. Well, working backwards, we would say, what happens when we get to this position? Well, let's see. The monopolist, whose payoffs are second, right? These are the payoffs to the entrant. These are the payoffs to the monopolist. The monopolist does what's rational. Since 2 is greater than 0, the monopolist should cooperate, right, if the game ever gets to this point. So knowing that the monopolist will do that at that point, we can just put these payoffs here, right? So now when we look at the incumbent's problem, the incumbent says, well, let's see, if I stay out, I get 1. If I enter, I get 2. Right? So now we've collapsed the decision down to the simplest possible comparison for the entrant, because we built in the best response, if you want to think about it that way, of the monopolist. So the entrant says, well, if I come into the industry, I get 2, because I know the monopolist will cooperate. They may say, right? Baker may say in my example that he will not, that he wants to have a price war, but once I enter, he will not find it rational to carry out that threat. So I know that if I enter, Baker will cooperate, and then we have this is our equilibrium. And the way I might say that is our subgame perfect Nash equilibrium, where everybody's behaving rationally along the whole tree. Right? Very simple, right? Once you know how to solve these things backwards, it's pretty straightforward exercise in just comparing two numbers most of the time. And in fact, when I'm doing my own theory and I'm trying to come up with ideas and write papers and all that stuff, oftentimes a good way to start with the complex decision situation is to just make it sequential, right? And then sort of work your way backwards through the sequence of decisions. So if I get to this point, I should do this. Back up. Well, given I'm going to do that, what should I do at the time before that, right? So on and so forth. So there's our outcome. Well, here we have the son and the father, who I inserted myself into this example as well. We can kind of do it the same way, right? The son says, well, let's see, if I behave, I get 0 and my dad gets 10 in payoffs, right? Well, if I misbehave, or if I do what I want, that'll put my father here in this position. Now, he says he's going to punish me with great regret if I don't do what he wants. But when the problem gets here, I know that my dad is comparing 0 and -1, right? He's not happy that I haven't done what I wanted, but what he wanted me to. But if he punishes me, that is also hard on him again. So if we get to this point, I know that he will not punish me, right? So now I'm making a comparison between 0 and 10, right? These are the payoffs of the first mover here. So we find out that I should not listen to my dad, says my son, and then he will not punish me. That's what happens in this game, right? Backwards induction, nice little recipe for solving this. So here I have a more complicated example. I modified the letters a little bit from the slides just so it looks like my famous right, left, up, down game, right? But now it's a sequential version of that game where player 1 chooses left or right. Player 2 then observes what was going on, right, or what player 1 did, and decides to go up or down. And these are the payoffs that result in each of these cases. So, for example, player 1 goes right, and player 2 goes up. Player 1 gets 3, and player 2 gets 1, right, is how you would read this. How do we solve it? Well, once again, we look at I guess you could even call it the low-hanging fruit, right, at the stuff at the bottom of the tree. And you would say, all right, well, let's see, if it gets to this point, player 2, the up-down chooser, well, let's see, if player 2 chooses down, that gives you 2. If player 2 chooses up, that will give player 2 1. So if the game gets to this point, we know that player 2 will choose this way, because 2 is greater than 1. The second number pertains to player 2, right? Well, let's do the same over here. If we get to this point, player 2 is comparing 2 and 1. Once again, player 2 will choose down, right? So we wind up with 0, 2 being here. So in some ways, what player 1 does is thinks through the game and says, well, whatever I do, player 2 is going to choose down. Right? What do I choose now? Now what I'm really doing is making a choice between left and right. So if I go right, I get 1. If I go left, I get 0. Right? So I should go right, and we find out that the outcome of our game, the subgame perfect Nash equilibrium, to use the lingo, is right down. Right? You might say those are the actions of players 1 and 2 respectively. So we wind up at this node. And of course you can do all the stuff we did with the game payoffs before. You can sort of think about the sum, right? And maybe the problem here is you can see, well, 1, 2, that's not a very high payoff for the players together, right? Societal welfare maybe would be higher if they could agree to go over here. But the problem is, whatever player 1 does, player 2 then always wants to go down, right, to choose the D action. So this is a little bit about how a sequential game works. This is the hardest example I would ever give you on a problem set, or maybe on an exam. So hopefully you can familiarize yourself with that. But you can get much more complex games. So this one here on the left is a pretty complex entry game, and I can kind of tell you what the logic is here. And it has 3 players. First of all, the logic is that a chain store in a market faces a sequence of entrants, right? Or maybe a chain store has a store in one market and in another market, and it has to sort of think about, someone's trying to enter market 1, what do I do? If whatever I do in market 1, maybe it will deter entry into market 2, if firms observe me being tough. So or entrants observe me being tough. And that's kind of what's going on here. So you see that first entrant is deciding to enter or stay out, right? The chain store can respond to entry by acquiescing, right, accommodating, or fighting, being aggressive, right? Entrant 2 then, based on what the chain store does in response to the first entrant's entry, can then decide to enter or stay out, and then there's another fight or acquiesce decision there. So, and you can see here we have the stay out, enter, fight, acquiesce. So we have 2 entrants who can either enter or stay out, and then we have a chain store that can either fight or acquiesce. And so this results in 9 possible configurations, I guess, of actions sequentially. So I made the mistake of working through this in my first class. It took too long relative to the payoff, but I'll let you try to ponder this a little bit, right? And you can see that, all you're really doing at the end of the day is comparing the very last nodes here and working backwards. And that exercise doesn't get any harder, even if the game is bigger. And so the centipede game is another one, which we You can think about it as a sort of continuation game where every period the players alternate deciding whether or not to continue the game or to bail, right, at any given time. And the idea is that if they it's kind of a dynamic prisoner's dilemma, right? If we both agree to stay in the game, both of our payoffs go up. But at any moment, if you jump ship, you can take a bigger share of the payoff. That's kind of the idea, and once again, it's a more complex decision game there. And I'll leave it to you guys to maybe ponder those for extra credit. Just duly noting that you can do pretty complex things and solve pretty complex problems with this sequential structure to these games. So, in fact, there's now I should have augmented this slide to talk about both behavioral game theory and experimental game theory. So it turns out there's a lot of games that we can describe, and some of the leading examples are sequential, right, where people don't actually behave according to the theory, right? Anomalies. So if everybody was perfectly rational the way that we think they are, they would do one thing, or put another way, the Nash equilibrium, or even the subgame perfect Nash equilibrium, would say people should behave in one way, right? But when they actually play these games, they behave in a completely different fashion, or in a different fashion than expected. So you might say, well, wait a minute, what do you mean play these games? Where do we actually observe someone playing? I mean, we know it's an approximation to reality, but even in reality, our games are so highly stylized, it would be hard to kind of think of someone playing the actual game. Well, it turns out there's this big field of economics called experimental game theory, and what we do is we actually test out the predictions of game theory in an experimental lab setting. How does that work? So NYU actually has an experimental game theory lab. What you do is you get an experiment together, and then you get a bunch of students like yourselves to sign up, right? And then you play these games, these simple 2x2 up, down, left, right, style games. And then we look at the results and we use statistical tools to analyze them, right? So we've actually had, our master's students have actually done some experimental game theory for master's theses. It's pretty interesting stuff. Okay, so what sorts of results are inconsistent with what we would predict in terms of game theory? Well, there's an ultimatum. The ultimatum game is one famous example. By the way, if you click on this here, you'll see, just as we have the list of games that like the Prisoner's Dilemma and the Stag Hunt, we have these funny names for the archetypal games, right, that have these particular characteristics. There are all these different sorts of, this is, I guess, not just game theory, but behavioral economics in general. It's this list of kind of classic situations in which people depart from rationality, if you want to read about any of these things. Okay, so what is an ultimatum game? This is a big one where people don't often do what we would predict they would do. So imagine that I have $1 million, right? I have $1 million, but you and I collectively have a decision to make about what's going to happen to this $1 million. Maybe the better way is I should say it this way. I could have $1 million. What I have to do is I need your approval. So what I do is I have to propose a split of that $1 million between you and I, right? So I, for example, could say you get $500,000, I get $500,000, right? And then you can say, all right, I agree to that. And if you agree to that, then we both get our money and we walk out the door and live happily ever after, right? If, however, you reject my proposal, nobody gets anything, right? So in some sense, I'm giving you an ultimatum and you say yes or no. Now, in terms of game theory, if we wanted to work through this using backwards induction, you would kind of do it the following way. You would say, if I'm making the decision to accept Baker's proposal, all I care about is that I get something, right? Something is always better than nothing. So whatever Baker offers me, if it's greater than 0, I should accept, right? That's kind of a dominant strategy here. Accept whatever Baker proposes, provided it's greater than 0. Back up a stage, now I'm the proposer. I say, well, let's see, I know that your strategy, your dominant strategy is to accept whatever I propose, right? So what then should I propose? Well, the answer is the smallest amount possible, right? Because that maximizes my payoff and you should accept it according to the theory. So I might say, all right, $1 million, I propose you get 10, maybe, how about $1, right? And I'll keep $999,999. What do you say? Now, it turns out that theory would say, you'd say, well, I'm not happy about just getting $1, I guess, but I'll accept it. It's better than nothing. But when people actually play this game, it turns out they reject such offers, right? And in fact, most people who do the proposing tend to anticipate this, and they typically make proposals that are closer to 50-50, right? And so that's a little bit of a departure from the way we would predict. And it's interesting to think why. You might think that people have this instinct hardwired into them to be fair, right? And that's one solution to this problem that we sort of ignore when we suppose that everybody's rational. That in these distributional settings, people care about fairness, maybe, right? What about the investment game? Yet another one we can solve via backwards induction. It goes a little something like this. So I'm an investor, you're an entrepreneur, right? I give you some money to invest, and then you go invest it, and I don't quite know what happens with your project. Maybe it succeeds, maybe it doesn't, right? But you get an even larger sum of money, maybe, on average, than I gave you, and then you have to determine how much to give back to me, right? To return for my investing in you in the first place. Now, the subgame perfect Nash equilibrium, if we were to sort of work through it in our minds, we'd say, well, let's see, if the game ever gets to that investment or that pay back the investment phase, if you're the entrepreneur, you should just say, oh, I'm sorry, it didn't work out. I lost all the money, right? And then just make off whatever you did in fact make, right? That would be kind of what the solution would be if the game comes to that point. Well, then the investor says, I know that that's what's going to happen if it comes to that point, so you know what I should do is give nothing to begin with. So we arrive at this kind of bleak equilibrium where I give you nothing to invest, and then you do not invest anything. Once again, it turns out when people play this game, right, usually some money is given, and some is invested, and then some is returned, right? I guess that's a happy outcome, right? And people aren't as self-interested and cynical, I guess, as we say in our theory. And so you might think about why that's the case, and you might say, well, once again, people have this, they like to. There's trust and there's fairness, and those are very hardwired instincts that people have, right? And that's sort of borne out in this investment game. So there's some anomalies. One other interesting thing, there's this big literature on what happens when the games don't come to an end, right? Or they don't come to an end with certainty. So you might think about this as like a friendship, something like that, right? Where, you engage in some sort of interaction with someone over time. And, just like your friends, you're not certain when you'll see them again. Maybe your friendships will last forever, right? So there's always another period where you could play this game, and it turns out then there's never any end to the decision tree, or no obvious end, I should say. And it turns out that those games have very different properties than the ones that we've had here. Suffice it to say that all sorts of crazy things can happen in those games. And it's kind of an interesting and fun area to talk about. I spend a lot of time on that in my graduate class, right? Okay, so that's a quick half an hour or so on game theory, or some of the other points of game theory. Let's circle back here now, halfway, 1/3 of the way through the lecture, and think about the big picture. Even having said what we've said about game theory, you might say that most of what I've said so far, with one exception, is pretty good about markets, in particular competitive markets, right? We use a competitive market as our benchmark. We've observed that it generates wonderful properties from the perspective of society, right? We wind up with maximal gains to exchange from a competitive market. Or think about it another way, we exhaust all the possibilities for mutually beneficial exchange in a market. We do all that. And then the other side of that coin is that messing around with the market, right? Putting taxes in there, price ceilings, price floors, all of those things tends to create deadweight loss, and that's a best case scenario, right? If that's our only problem, we're doing well with our market intervention, because there's also these second order problems, right? Rationing, if we have rent control, for example, we saw that we create a shortage of housing, and then we face this question, how do we determine who gets the housing, right? In addition to creating the deadweight loss, and that can be costly too. Okay. So this leaves us in a rather weird position, in that we have if you want to think about why we have these policies, you can be cynical about it, right? And say, well, it's just that people don't know. We keep having these rent control, minimum wage, price supports, whatever. Maybe people are well-intentioned, maybe not. They just don't know they just don't know. They haven't taken intro econ, they don't understand surpluses and all that. You could be a little bit more malicious in understanding policy, as I've told you the story so far, and you could say, well, it's these competing interests, right, that where one sort of wins out and gets the policy that they want at the expense of the other. So an example might be rent control. There's a lot more renters than landlords. Maybe it's just the renters are able to outvote the landlords. Well, that sounds pretty bleak too, right? Maybe you think it's about vested versus unvested interests. And what I mean by this is, if you think about the rental market, it consists of people who may want apartments in the future, those who have them, and landlords. The left out interest is people who are going to be looking for apartments down the road, right? They're the most impacted. So maybe it's because they don't really have, a vote at the moment we're talking about in the neighborhood that these things happen. And you might even think about the lack, people just don't sort of think about counterfactuals, right? In the way that we do, where we say, all right, well, without, we're going to do a comparison of those two things. So suffice it to say, you have these various explanations for why we would have policy, or these sorts of interventions, and none of them seem particularly, charitable, I'll say, to policy, right? You might even, have heard that economists have reputations as being relatively politically conservative, and this slide would certainly suggest why, right? It's that policy doesn't work, is kind of the overarching method. Of course, we did have one big exception to this, and this was the monopoly setting, right? Where, in general, we saw that market power posed a problem from the perspective of society, right? Prices too high, output too low. What do we do to solve this problem, right? Well, we want to get our market to behave more competitively, right? And as a result, we now have this role for policy. That is to say, what's happening on the ground is different than what a competitive market would do. How do we get things to look competitive? So that's where we regulate. What we're going to talk about now are so-called externalities, which you might think of as, if you wanted to think about it narrowly defined, you could think about it as environmental economics. And really what it is, along with monopoly or market power, it's another example of so-called market failure, right? That is to say, just letting the market sit there and do what it does not generate the best result for society, right? And in fact, once I've talked for another 10 or so minutes, you'll probably convince yourself that, the market maybe almost never does what's best for society when left on its own, right? The problems that posed by externalities in a market are that general, right? And so this, by the way, goes with this generic theme that if we have this idea that our market is creating some deadweight loss, organized as it is, well, there's our avenue for policy, and that will be the same thing here. Now, one big difference here is that, which is maybe even more damning, is that in the monopoly case, the monopolist, right, is sort of violating the direct assumptions of the competitive model, right? Remember, we had large numbers of small competitors, homogeneous products, all that stuff, right? Well, the externality, it might be even worse because we're still going to maintain all those assumptions, right? large numbers of competitors, nobody controls market price, homogeneous product, that all works, but now our market is not going to give us a socially desirable result. And we'll be able to work all that out here. So what is an externality? It's a strange word. You might think about external as being the big root there. What we think about an externality occurring is a situation in which our economic activity, you can think about it as a trade in a market. The trade in a market influences a third party who is not party to that exchange, right? Or better yet, imposes a cost. In one particular case, imposes a cost on someone who is not privy to the transaction. So a great example, years ago I went to Puerto Rico with the family, and we did the usual thing where they have all these excursions and all that, and we went on this AV ride where you go to, there's a local agency, and they pick you up at your hotel, and you go and you ride around in the forest, the tropical forest on an AV, and it's a lot of fun, right? I guess ATV would be better. So you ride around and everybody has a great time. You're paying for it, right, and getting some benefits. Meanwhile, the people providing the tour, they're doing the usual business thing, supplying a good, getting the benefits. Everybody's happy, except for one group isn't happy. That might be the local people who live around the forest, right? They have all the dust and all the noise produced by these ATVs, and they therefore are bearing some of the costs of this operation, right? But I don't think about that, and maybe the people running the tour don't think about that either. So we're making our exchange decision without thinking about somebody who's impacted by it. Well, another example of a similar effect, drivers, gas stations, right? Or companies that provide gas, oil in general. So, you go, you fill up your tank, you drive around, you pay some money for gas, the gas station collects some money. Transaction like any other, right? We both benefit from that. The problem is the act of driving around and using the gas creates pollution. Air pollution for everybody, right? So, in that sense, we've impacted society at large by virtue of making our exchange. We're imposing a cost on everyone else. So I have some other examples here. Agricultural products. For example, if you're buying dairy products, well, cows, it turns out, create a lot of waste, which maybe gets in the water supply, creates algae growths in rivers and things like that, and that impacts fishing or people's recreational use of water. So in all these cases, there's people who are influenced who are not part of the transaction. Same with selling steel. So the one I mention here is really what I have in mind is steel as a stand-in for the Northeast industrial base of the United States. So, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Maryland, New York, New Jersey, all these plants engaged in heavy industry. Well, in the past, it used to be that they would let off a certain amount of smoke with pollutants like sulfur dioxide, stuff like that. This stuff would drift to the northeast, right? Just kind of with the weather pattern, and then come down or become parts of clouds and come down as rain. We called that acid rain, right? And it was damaging to a lot of the forests of the northeast of the United States and Canada. How many people have heard of acid rain? Okay, most people have heard of it. Big problem today? Weird, huh? You don't really hear about the big acid rain problem anymore. And most of you are like, well, I know what it is, but it's not this big deal. When I was a kid, we talked about it all the time, right? And it turns out that environmental policy, not quite along the lines that I'm going to describe here, maybe next class, really did quite a bit to help solve that problem. Generically, though, maybe you can even see intuitively what happens in these markets with externalities is that there's too much of an activity, right, of these negative externalities, these costs anyways. Now, of course, I've framed everything in terms of markets, right? So we're talking about activities that occur in markets. That doesn't have to be the case, right? Oftentimes people just make decisions and you sort of do it with yourself in mind and you impact someone else without really thinking about the impact you're having on some other person or everyone else. So this might be the case when you steal stuff, well, not you, but when someone steals something from a store, right? They say, well, there might be a chance I get caught. but I'll get away with this product, this deodorant or shaving cream or whatever. If I steal it, I just have to think about those things. How likely is it I'm going to get caught? What do I get when I get the product? But in reality, there's a lot of other people impacted by that decision as well, right? So for example, the store might have to raise its prices to cover the losses due to theft, and we all bear that cost. Or maybe the store starts putting everything behind glass, right, and you have to buzz a button for an attendant, and then that's a costly thing for us as well. So that's one example. So I have some other examples here which we might get to talk about next time. And maybe I'll just say it this way. If you look at bullet points, smoking is an example where this happens. When someone smokes, there's, smell and smoke and all that stuff. You bother other people. That's something like an externality. Loud music, maybe you irritate people by playing loud music on the subway, right? And then these last two examples, you'll see they're actually court cases, Boomer v. Atlantic Cement and Sturgis v. Bridgman. These are famous examples of externalities that are kind of local and kind of idiosyncratic. So Boomer v. Atlantic Cement was a case that took place in upstate New York, and it had to do with a cement company that had a plant that was kicking up a lot of dust and making a lot of noise and impacting the property values of nearby residents. Right? So the cement company was sued by the residents, and then there was a big lawsuit about what should happen. Right? And so I used to teach a lot of law and economics, and this was the sort of case you would talk about and what the legal remedies are to these externality problems. Sturgis v. Bridgman was another case we like to talk about, and that had to do with a confectioner. This was the 1880s. Confectioner, someone who makes candy, right? And this confectioner had an office next door to a doctor's office. And it turned out, I guess back in the day, making candy was really noisy. And it was interrupting the doctor's practice, right? And so the question then becomes, imposing an externality there. The noise that you're creating is hurting my output as a doctor. What is to be done? And there's some interesting aspects to these cases that maybe we'll get into a little bit next time. It bears mentioning that externalities are not always negative. There's a lot of positive externalities out there. Right? Oftentimes you do things that benefit third parties in positive ways. So when you go out to buy Christmas ornaments and things like that, or decorate your tree, or Halloween decorations maybe, put them on your house, well, maybe you enjoy those and you like that your neighbors enjoy that, but everybody who drives by can also see your ornaments and get some enjoyment out of it, right? Your decorations. That's a positive externality. When we have farmland, right? When you're a farmer and you have this, beautiful farmland out there, and you drive across the countryside and say, "Oh, look at the cows, look at the beautiful cornfields." You say, "Boy, that's wonderful scenery." The farmer probably isn't thinking about the wonderful scenery as much as they're thinking about making a living, but engaging in their farm practice creates this positive externality. Beekeeping and orchards, another example of that effect. So there's actually, you may or may not know this, there's a lot of beekeeping going on in New York City. It's a pretty common, rooftop activity. And so people like to have bees because, they make honey and all that stuff. But it turns out they also create positive externalities for everybody who has flowers, right, in their window boxes or whatever. Because bees fly around and pollinate all the flowers, right? So there's that effect as well. Now this one, I've had a hard time convincing my wife about aspects of this one. So when you buy a jacket or a soccer ball or a water bottle for your child, it's often the case that you're creating a positive externality for someone else. Well, why is this the case? Because your kids lose these things at an alarming rate, right? And eventually someone else finds them and then can say, "Wow, look at this jacket somebody just left here on the soccer field. I can give that to my nephew, or I can, my child, they can wear it. Somebody kicked this soccer ball over into the bushes and I just found it. Well, now I have a brand new soccer ball, right?" So you get the idea there. Now, we'll see that one of the implications here is that things that have external costs, we do too much of from the perspective of society. Things that have external benefits, we do too little of from the perspective of society. And I've had trouble convincing my wife that we should buy higher quality jackets because somebody else also will be enjoying the jacket, right? Not just us. By the way, there is an article here that's kind of an amusing take on that particular thing. I got the idea, pretty famous guy, Robert Barrow, and he's talking about golf balls from this perspective, right? Something that you lose frequently. Okay, so, whoops, let me see here. What's going on here? There we go. So one thing we might do, or one thing we could do, is we could return to our usual tools and think about these things from the perspective of game theory. And indeed, this is one way you often think about these actions that people take that have implications for others. Is you guessed it, the classic prisoner's dilemma to show this. So this is one way we might attack this problem. So the top example is a particular type of externality. It's called a common pool problem, right? Or you might even think about it, take it literally, it's a fishery, right? So here's the scenario where you and I have access to a small pond, right, with some fish in it. And you know what? We have a couple of decisions we can make when we fish in this pond. So I can fish, and I can do so carefully from the perspective of the environment. You might think about this as sustainable fishing. I'm careful not to take out too many fish. I'm careful about not taking out fish that are too small or too big, as the case may be. And so what I decided, I just fish sustainably. So if I'm doing that, it might take me a little bit longer to get my output, but I'll get a payoff of 2. And if you do the same, you'll get a payoff of 2 as well. Now, it occurs to me, though, that if you're behaving sustainably and I behave, maybe recklessly, just because I want to get my fish and get out of there, or maybe I want more fish than I usually get, well, then because you're behaving sustainably, I can take advantage of that, right, and get a high payoff. So, in that sense, if you're fishing sustainably and I'm not, I get 3 instead of 2. And there's no fish left for you, effectively. So if we work out the math this way, right, if everybody sort of has that attitude, then we wind up in the lower right-hand corner with lower payoffs for everyone, just like our prisoner's dilemma. So this is a standard model of a common property resource, right? Fishing is a classic example, where we have this incentive to overuse, right, the resource. We'll talk about that next time, because once we do our standard supply and demand externality thing, we'll talk about policy and all of that. So here's another example that you may or may not have encountered. It's the kind of sustainable party example, where you might sort of think about it this way. You have some housemates or roommates, whatever, you share an apartment with, and you decide to have a party, and there's a couple things you can do. One of which is you can kind of, hold back a little bit with the partying, take it easy, clean up as you go, that sort of thing. And the other thing you can do is you can just go crazy, right? And so you might think about, if everybody sort of parties sustainably, parties and cleans up and all that stuff as we go along, we all have a pretty good time. Of course, if you're cleaning up and I'm going crazy, that's great for me, right? You bear all the costs of my craziness, and I get to have the best possible time, right? Now, if everybody decides to party hard, I guess, now we've trashed the house, and everybody winds up worse off in the end, right? So you might have noticed this effect if you have a lot of roommates. I had a couple of roommates in college for many years. And one example of this effect was that our common spaces tended to be in much worse shape than our individual rooms. So, for example, the kitchen and the bathrooms are pretty rough. So, prisoner's dilemma kind of suggests one direction we might go to analyze these problems. We might think about this as in a slightly different fashion that captures the logic in such a way so that we can, once again, return to our old friends, supply and demand. So, and of course, we draw supply and demand diagrams for everything, so this is yet another way of reflecting the idea that maybe this problem is fairly pervasive, right? Once you see it, it's hard to unsee it in just about every market you might think of. So if you go back to my factory example, the factory polluting the air, say. Really, one way of thinking about what's going on here is the factory is using up something that it isn't paying for. That is to say, it's using an input in production that it's not paying for in some, input market, say. So what the factory is doing in the air pollution example is using air to produce its product. And it's free, so it does too much, right, of what it's doing. It doesn't consider these costs. So, of course, that interpretation, maybe you have to stretch it a little bit, but also works for, noise pollution as well. So you think about, airline flights coming into an airport all hours of the night. It creates a lot of noise for the neighborhood. You might think about that as the airport is using up silence in production of its product, right? Airline landings and takeoffs. Well, this will allow us to map our problem into supply and demand. So here I have my aluminum market, right? And it'll kind of let us see what we want to do here. So, really no big shocker here. We have quantity. I should have had a price line there too. We have a market quantity and a market price that happen in our market naturally as we've understood such things since the beginning of the semester. Now, one thing I've done here is I've put in this private value and private cost, right? And that's to reflect this idea that supply and demand, those are the things that are considered directly, right? So, for example, you're a producer of aluminum. You think about, the workers you have to pay, the raw materials you have to buy, the equipment you have to buy, all of that stuff. Those are costs you incur. But you're not necessarily thinking about other costs, right? External costs, things you use up that you're not paying for, like water or clean air or, things like that, clean water, clean air. So we might say in my example that, aluminum smelting creates air pollution. And so, of course, you can look at this and you can look at all the surpluses. Now, one nice way of viewing the problem this way is we can leverage the fact that our supply curve is also a marginal cost curve, right? And we can say, well, every act of production, right, and trade in this market, not only does it involve some costs to the firm that are on the supply curve, but it involves some additional costs to society, right? And what we could do is we can add those costs and create this true marginal cost curve or social marginal cost curve. And that's what I've done here, right? So I've shifted this line up by this amount, and that amount would reflect the additional costs imposed on society, right? And this is great because now we can leverage this and we can say, all right, well, let's see. We can think about what happens when firms only think about their private costs, and we can think about what should happen when firms take into account their private costs plus any other costs they're imposing on society, right? And the lesson is pretty simple. We now have a private supply curve and a social supply curve, right? Where the social supply curve is above because there's more costs than the firm is considering. And here's one of the big takeaways is that, well, the market gives us a quantity that's too high and a price that's too low, right? Too high relative to what, too low relative to what? Well, relative to what the social supply curve would give us, right? The private costs plus the societal costs, what would that give us? Well, it would give us a lower quantity and it would be at a higher price. Right? So maybe you've even heard this in the ongoing debate about carbon taxation and all that stuff, right? That, the problem is it's, carbon-based fuels, the price is too low. Well, that's kind of what they're insinuating here when people make such an argument. That you'd want to be at a point like this and not like this. So it's actually neat. You can work through all this in terms of a supply and demand diagram. So I have an example here where I can work out all the numbers and the consumer surplus and all that stuff. So I think I remember how this goes. I can tell you what all of this is in a second. I'll just copy it over. This is 100. Call that 2, 5. This is 6, 4, 80. Okay, and I think that's, of course I didn't label my Q or my P. Let me just turn this off here and I will describe all the numerics here of this example. So this is a standard supply and demand graph, but let me, where we have our naturally occurring market equilibrium here, at this point 5, 100. So put another way, in equilibrium, in the competitive market equilibrium, the price of this product is 5 and the quantity traded is 100, right? Okay, but we see here that I've added in this wrinkle that each unit produces $2 of external damages to someone, right? So it sullies the air in such a way that, to the tune of $2 per unit. Now there is this big issue about measurement, right, where we come up with that number, but let's not worry about that, and let's suppose that we have, and we know that the value of the resource used up is $2. So in reality, we know that each point along our supply curve reflects the costs of producing each unit, but now we're saying the true costs are, well, the private costs to the firms plus 2. And so you shift up this supply curve by 2, those 2 additional units of cost. And that's how we get this point here, which occurs at 6, 80, right? So you can see here that the quantity is too low. The quantity is too high and the price is too low in the competitive equilibrium relative to the societal best case scenario, right? So one thing we can do is we can actually work out all of these numbers, and you can think about this as yet another deadweight loss problem, right? That here we have a deadweight loss due to the externality. And you can actually see it quite nicely on the graph. So to do this, what we can first do is think about what our producer surplus and consumer surplus are like at the competitive equilibrium, right? Now, that's pretty simple because we know how to do this. We see that our consumer surplus below demand yet above price. This distance is 5. This distance is 100. So this triangle up here has an area of 500 divided by 2 is 250, right? Producer surplus before, right, or at the competitive equilibrium, I should say, is once again 5, 0 to 5, below price yet above supply, to 100, divided by 2 is 250 as well. So those are our people happily buying and selling aluminum, say, in this market. They're earning consumer surplus to the sum of this entire red shaded triangle, to 500, right? That's great, but there's $2 of damages for each unit produced, right? Each unit produced. Now, we can actually see that in a number of ways on this diagram. You can think about it as this area down here, right? Because this distance is 2, this distance is 100. 2 times 100. 2 times 100 is 200. So we have 200 in environmental damage. You can also think about it as sort of going vertically this way, right? Each of these is $2. And so you could think about this trapezoid as also being a graphical depiction of this all. So we probably want to subtract those out when we're thinking about societal welfare, right? The total gains from exchange, less the costs imposed on third parties, put another way. So if we do this, our total surplus is 300, right? Well, what about the case where we could get production to sort of, let's suppose we could somehow do this from the perspective of society. Little foreshadowing here, we might know how to do this already. Let's suppose we could somehow get the price to be 6 and we could stop the quantity at 80, right? So it's almost like the monopoly problem, from a different perspective. We're saying what happens if we could just restrict quantity to 80 somehow. Well, you can see here, then our producer surplus would be this whole area here, right? Up to the market quantity. We just stick to our guns, below price, above supply. Well, let's see, that area is going to be, PS is well, let's see, 8 times 4 is 320, divided by 2 is 160. That's this triangle here. We add in this rectangle. 2 times 80, 160. And then consumer surplus is just this area up here. 10 minus 6 is 4 times 80, 320 divided by 2 to get the area of a triangle. Consumer surplus is 160, right? So we wind up adding up all these things. We get 480. Is that right? Yeah? Now, however, we also have to throw in the problem we've created, which is the environmental damages at this point here, which I've called the social optimum, where social supply and demand intersect, right? Total external costs, total societal costs, and demand. Well, let's see. The externality at this point, there's 80 units produced. Each unit still produces 2 units, $2 in damage. So 80 times 2 is 160. So we subtract out and we get 320, right? So you can see here what the lesson is that producer plus consumer surplus minus damages at the best case scenario for society is 320. Consumer surplus plus producer surplus less damages at the competitive equilibrium is 300. This is greater than this, right? Put another way, our competitive market is generating a deadweight loss of $20, right? $20. And so, once again, now that we have this deadweight loss, more on this in a second, we might start thinking about corrective policy. One way, by the way, of picturing the deadweight loss, it's this triangle right here. That's the deadweight loss, right? And it's actually 5, 7. So you can see here it's 20 times 2 is 40, divided by 2 is 20. So this triangle is the deadweight loss. Why is this triangle the deadweight loss? Think about it this way. All these units are produced, right? These 20 units are produced. Each unit costs something like this to produce and causes benefits something like this. The costs are actually greater than the benefit for each unit in this range. And if we add up all the differences between the costs and the benefits, we see there's overproduction. We're producing units that are more costly than the benefits they create. All such benefits are summed up in that little deadweight loss triangle. Okay, so take a couple minutes here to talk about policy. We once again have the same setting we had in monopoly. There's a deadweight loss. Our market outcome is creating deadweight loss, so as policymakers we want to jump in and figure out what to do. So there's a couple things we could do. One of which is to regulate quantity. We could just say, all right, well, we're going to somehow restrict this market to 80 units, right? Maybe through licensing, something like that, right? Quantity restrictions on firms, that's one way to do it. Another thing to do is to regulate prices through taxes, right? So, and maybe this is, it just pops right out at you from the diagram, maybe it does. We already know how to shift a supply curve like that for a firm. Does anybody remember how to do that? How do we shift the supply curve up parallel to itself? Well, remember, if we just put a tax on the good, right, that's like adding a cost to the firm for each unit produced. And one way of solving that problem mechanically, if you think back to the days of the tax wedge, shifting demand or supply back, that's exactly what happens. And indeed, you might even think about that as what's going on as we move from the green to the blue line. We've just put a $2 tax on the good, in which case the firm will behave as if it's paying for the resource that it's using. Yes?
But that's all assuming that we can and would know the exact price of that change, right? Excellent question.
That's all assuming that we could know exactly what numbers we want, what the damages are, what the tax should be. I will say this, as economists, we think of the taxes as being better than the quantities, just because it's not always true, but generally speaking, because the taxes allow the firms to still find the most efficient way to produce. That's a little bit harder with quantity. But your other question is a good one. We need to know the cost structure and all of that stuff. It turns out, though, as clever economist says, we'll see next time, we don't need to do all this. Right? We'll have ways around this. But before I do that, let's, kind of like what I did with Monopoly. I know I can't go on forever about this stuff. We can talk a little bit about the regulatory history and the history of the theory and how it all worked out and some of the questions that have emerged from this. And so this is, if you're interested in these sorts of things, law and economics, environmental economics, of course, is a big field. And it talks a lot about this. So back in history, most of this material, this idea that we could have a corrective tax equal to the externality, goes back to Alfred Pigou, right? A famous British economist. I think I want to make sure I got his name correct there. Arthur Pigou. Did I say Alfred? Arthur Pigou is his name. Okay. That's not great for someone who teaches history of a thought. And he came up with this whole theory which said, well, if there's a business damaging, creating external damages, just slap a tax in there, try to get it equal to the damages. That does the job there. And you might even think about it as the government is making the firm pay for the input that it's using that it isn't paying for. That's all. You're giving it a price to pay. So, we've had some interesting inroads with this sort of thing. For one example of this is congestion, which is a type of externality, right? So the story would go something like this. When you get out there on the road and drive around, you don't think about, maybe you think about traffic and all that stuff, but you don't think about the fact that you're, incrementally maybe increasing the traffic that everybody else faces, right? Like when you get into when you go out and drive, you don't say, well, I'm slowing everybody else down with my commute. But that's kind of what congestion is, right? Us collectively or us individually making commuting decisions, not thinking about the impact on the whole. And so the idea behind congestion pricing, right, was to sort of make people pay a fee for using a car in the city that reflected the externality they were paying on everybody else. Of course, one of the benefits from this exercise was that the government was supposed to make a lot of money, right? Ideally, you wouldn't sort of have a revenue goal there. You'd say, well, the policy would be to get the price right, to get the social optimum. So I have some thoughts on that that maybe we'll talk about next time. But that's an example. Another example is population. Right, which is another, population growth in general. Some people think there's too many people in the world. That's a version of this congestion externality as well, right? Additional people in the world creates pressures on the environment and all that stuff. And it's interesting, this has been a very large area for application of economic or controls, right? So a lot of different countries throughout history have sort of thought about this. Famously, China, right, had a policy to restrict population growth in the famous one-child policy, right, which basically said you should have one child per family. Any more than that, and we're going to penalize you in some way. But there were exceptions to this. So that was a famous example. You might say that this was not really the preferred perspective of an economist. You would prefer to use the tax if you had to rely on one instrument. And once again, why is this the case? Because then firms are still able to decide, how to produce something. If you're kind of telling them what to do production-wise, now you're really getting deep in the weeds with figuring out information. Interestingly, if you look at the history of the United States, you might not realize this, but if you go back 50 or even 80, 100 years, we had some extremely bad environmental problems in this country, right? So one example of this, kind of talking about the industrial heartland, around Lake Erie, all that stuff. Here's kind of a fun example of something that happened.
Always has been and must be a working river.
I'll fast forward through this. This is the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland. You can see big industrial center here. It doesn't look great, right?
Water for our pleasures, recreation, and as a theme of beauty. She has remained low profile through our lifetimes.
A lot of industry there.
The tremendous industrial development. Few events of memorable significance have taken place on her waters or on her banks. With all the clamor and din of mills, refineries, factories, the river has gone about her business quietly and has been taken for granted. She received some publicity in 1936 when a spark from a blowtorch being used to dismantle a boat ignited floating waste.
So the Cuyahoga River actually caught fire because it was so polluted in the 1930s. And you know, I'm not a chemist, but I don't think that's supposed to happen. This was the case of a lot of our waterways, in particular around the Northeast. So the East River, you know, the Hudson, terribly polluted, right? New York City, awful, all around New York City. There's a movie I liked when I was a kid. It was called Chud. And it was cannibalistic humanoid underground dwellers. And it was about these guys who were like bad guys who were hiding toxic waste in the subway, abandoned subways. Weird movie, creating zombies that way. Anyway, so everything was really polluted. And in the early 70s, we had a series of acts that were passed, the Clean Air and Clean Water Act, designed to clean up all this situation. So, long story short, these things really worked. These Clean Air and Clean Water Act. For example, nowadays you can go fishing in Lake Erie without too much problem. We have a nice striped bass run in the East River, right? There's a lot of, they're actually, I don't know if they're productive fisheries, but there's fish and the water's fairly clean and all of that stuff, which is somewhat miraculous if you think back to how bad things were when I was a kid. This is also true about a lot of the air and the smog problems that we famously had. We don't have those nearly as, they aren't present to the degree that they once were. And in fact, there's a really nice write-up of this here that talks about the degree to which these policies worked. And you can see here that we're talking about hundreds of percentage points change in all these various dimensions. Greenery, how much pollution there is. Look at how bad the air was back even in the early 2000s. If you go back into the 80s and 70s, it was probably twice as worse. So Clean Air and Clean Water Act really cleaned up things. Now, if you're an economist, of course, any cause for joy you're more than willing to crush. And you would say about these things, well, it's not so much what they did, we're happy about that, it's how we did it. So both of these pieces of legislation were what we might call command and control legislations. That is to say, what they did was they said, firms have to use this technology, in analogy with our diagrams, they have to produce certain quantities, right? It was very much that sort of scenario. Not the tax-based approach that we might think about. Well, economists came along and said, well, it's not so much whether or not the policy worked, it's how much did it cost to get what we got. And the answer economists arrived at, fiddling with equations and numbers and all that stuff, was that these policies were much, much more costly, right? Orders of magnitude more costly for society than they had to be. And there were some better ways, right, to attack these things. It turns out that one way to attack these problems is to actually leverage this idea that something's being used that isn't being bought and sold, or isn't being paid for. And it is to establish a market for these resources that are being used. And as I will talk about next time, hopefully, this idea that you can establish a market for something, partially maybe by establishing ownership, in some instances, is one of the great sort of theoretical insights and policy successes that economists have generated, and it actually has direct bearing on this acid rain thing that we all know about, but don't really think about too much today. Great economic policy to get the acid out of the rain. Anyways, I will see you next time. We'll have some practice materials ready, and we'll talk about all that stuff.